The enigmatic message left by the disappearing library book, a Miss Marple mystery. Hi there, welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's mystery begins in the village library, where a single book vanished from the shelves without record or explanation. At first, it seemed like a simple borrowing error, until a strange message was discovered inside the book's catalogue card, a note written in haste, hinting at something urgently hidden. As the villagers dismiss it as harmless mischief, Miss Marple notices the troubling details, the page marked too carefully, the handwriting that doesn't quite match, and the uneasy silence of those who knew the book best. She soon realizes the message was not meant to be found by everyone, but by someone very specific. Because this was no ordinary disappearance. It was a warning. Before we follow Miss Marple into the quiet corners of the library, don't forget to subscribe for more haunting Miss Marple mysteries on Haunting Vales. Chapter 1: The Enigmatic Message Left by the Disappearing Library Book. The village library of St. Meadows was not the sort of place where mysteries were meant to begin. It was quiet, orderly, and deeply predictable, a narrow red brick building tucked between the post office and the florist, smelling faintly of dust, polish, and old paper. People came here to escape noise, not to encounter it. Yet on that pale Tuesday morning, when the bell above the door chimed and Miss Marple stepped inside, something unseen had already gone terribly wrong. The librarian, Mrs. Eliza Crowther, sat stiffly behind the main desk, her hands folded as if in prayer, though there was no peace in her eyes. Her spectacles were slightly crooked, and a thin line of worry had carved itself between her brows. She looked up when Miss Marple approached, relief flickering across her face like a candle catching flame. "I'm so glad you've come," Mrs. Crowther said, lowering her voice even though the room was empty. "I truly didn't know who else to ask." Miss Marple smiled gently, removing her gloves with deliberate care. "Libraries," she said, "have always been places where secrets hide in plain sight. Now then, tell me what has upset you so." Mrs. Crowther hesitated, then reached beneath the desk and produced a ledger, its cover worn thin by decades of careful handling. She opened it to a marked page and slid it across. "It's a book," she said. "Or rather, the absence of one." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and examined the page. The handwriting was neat, disciplined, the sort that came from a lifetime of routine. One title was circled in red ink. "The Complete Village Records of St. Meadows, Volume 3. "A reference book," Miss Marple observed. "Not something one simply borrows." "Exactly," Mrs. Crowther replied. "It never leaves the building. It hasn't in over 50 years. Yet yesterday morning, when I unlocked the shelves, it was gone." Miss Marple looked up sharply. "Gone entirely?" Mrs. Crowther nodded. "No sign of forced entry? No torn pages? No disturbance? Just an empty space where it has always stood?" Miss Marple leaned back slightly, her gaze drifting toward the tall oak shelves lining the walls. The gap was subtle, but once seen, it was impossible to ignore. It was like a missing tooth in an otherwise perfect smile. "And the message," Miss Marple said softly. Mrs. Crowther's hands trembled as she reached into her pocket and produced a folded slip of paper. "This," she said. "I found it inside the returns drawer. I know for certain it was not there the night before." Miss Marple unfolded the note carefully. The paper was aged, yellowed at the edges, as though it had been torn from a much older book. The handwriting was deliberate, firm, and unsettlingly calm. Some stories are not meant to be reread. Some names are safer forgotten. Look not for the book. Look for what it was hiding. Miss Marple read it twice, then a third time, her expression unreadable. "This was meant to be found," she said at last. which is often far more troubling than something meant to be hidden. Mrs. Crowther swallowed. You think someone from the village took it? I think, Miss Marple replied gently, that someone from this village is afraid. The library door opened, and the silence fractured. Mr. Harold Finch, chairman of the historical committee, bustled in with his usual air of self-importance. He stopped short when he saw Miss Marple. Oh, he said, forcing a smile. I didn't realize we had company. I'm merely helping Mrs. Crowther, Miss Marple said pleasantly. A book appears to have wandered off. Mr. Finch's face stiffened. That book, he said quickly, is of no real importance. Outdated records. Dry material. Then I wonder, Miss Marple said, tilting her head slightly, why your hand is shaking. Mr. Finch looked down as if surprised to find it so. He laughed too loudly. Nonsense. I simply dislike disorder. Miss Marple watched him closely. People who feared disorder, she knew, were often those with something to lose when order collapsed. As he turned away toward the shelves, Miss Marple noticed something else. A faint smear of ink on his cuff. Not fresh, but not old either. Mr. Finch, she said lightly, do you often write notes by hand? He paused. Of course. One must preserve tradition. Indeed, Miss Marple replied. Tradition can be very revealing. That afternoon, word spread quickly. In a village like St. Meadows, secrets traveled faster than truth. By evening, the missing book was the subject of hushed conversations, lowered voices, and glances over shoulders. Miss Marple took her tea at home, the note spread before her on the table. She traced the word slowly with her finger. The message was not a threat. It was a warning. And warnings, she knew, were rarely given without reason. Volume 3 covered a specific period in the village's past. A time of land disputes, sudden inheritances, and one unexplained death that had officially been ruled an accident. Officially. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. Disappearing books, she murmured, have a habit of returning in the most inconvenient ways. Outside, the church bell tolled the hour. Somewhere in St. Meadows, someone was very much hoping that the past would remain exactly where it belonged. They were about to be disappointed. Chapter 2, The Enigmatic Message That Refused to Stay Silent. Morning in St. Meadows arrived gently, as it always did, with pale sunlight spilling across hedges trimmed into neat obedience and curtains drawn back by hands that preferred not to linger on what troubled them. Yet beneath this calm surface, the village stirred with unease. The missing library book had become more than a curiosity. It had become a question no one wished to answer aloud. Miss Marple walked slowly toward the village green, her steps unhurried, her eyes observant. Experience had taught her that when people were frightened, they revealed more than they intended, not through words, but through habits they suddenly altered. A glance held too long, a greeting avoided, a door closed just a moment too quickly. At the corner near the baker's shop, she paused. Two women stood whispering beside the notice board, their heads inclined toward one another like conspirators. When Miss Marple approached, they fell silent at once, smiles appearing with practiced speed. "Good morning," Miss Marple said warmly. "Good morning," they echoed, almost in unison, before hurrying away. Miss Marple watched them go. Fear, she reflected, always traveled in pairs. One person feared the truth. Another feared being associated with it. Her destination was the library once more. Mrs. Crowther had sent word early that something else had been found. Something she had not dared examine alone. Inside, the air felt heavier than the day before. Mrs. Crowther stood near the reference shelves, wringing her hands. "It appeared overnight," she said, gesturing to the desk. "I locked everything myself. I'm certain of it." Miss Marple approached the desk and saw at once what had caused the distress. A book lay there, not the missing volume, but a slim notebook bound in faded blue cloth. It was not part of the library's collection. "This was not here before," Mrs. Crowther whispered. Miss Marple lifted it carefully. The cover bore no title. When she opened it, the pages were filled with handwriting, precise and controlled, the same hand as the earlier message. Names filled the pages. Dates. Small notes written in the margins, some crossed out, others underlined with unsettling emphasis. "These are village names," Mrs. Crowther said, her voice trembling. "Some are still living." "Yes," Miss Marple replied softly. "And some are not." One name, in particular, caught her eye. Thomas Bellamy. A man who had died 20 years earlier after falling from the old quarry path. An accident, the village had said. An unfortunate misstep. Yet beside his name was written a single word. Witness. Miss Marple closed the notebook. "Someone wants us to look," she said. "But only in the direction they choose." Before Mrs. Crowther could reply, the library door opened again. This time, it was Clara Hughes, the school teacher. She paused when she saw Miss Marple and the notebook. "I heard," Clara said carefully, "that something else had happened." "News travels quickly," Miss Marple observed. "In villages like ours," Clara replied, "it always does. Especially bad news." Miss Marple studied her. Clara Hughes was a woman accustomed to control. Her posture was straight, her expression composed, yet there was a tightness around her mouth that betrayed strain. "Do you recognize this handwriting?" Miss Marple asked, holding up the notebook. Clara's eyes flicked to it for the briefest moment before she shook her head. No. But she was lying. Not poorly, but instinctively, as one did when the truth felt dangerous. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to the quarry path. It was overgrown now, rarely used, the stones uneven and treacherous. She stood at the edge where Thomas Bellamy had supposedly slipped, looking down at the jagged rocks below. Accidents happened, of course. But villages had a habit of choosing which accidents to remember and which to quietly reshape. Footsteps approached behind her. "I wondered if I'd find you here," said Mr. Finch. Miss Marple turned calmly. "Did you? I thought you might like to see the truth of it," he said, gesturing downward. "A dangerous place. Anyone could have fallen." "Anyone," Miss Marple agreed. "Or been helped." Mr. Finch stiffened. "You're suggesting something most improper." "I am suggesting nothing," Miss Marple replied. "I am merely listening to what the past is saying now that someone has forced it to speak." He hesitated, then said quietly, "That book should never have been touched." "Because it contained facts," Miss Marple asked gently, "or because it contained consequences?" Mr. Finch did not answer. Instead, he turned away, leaving Miss Marple alone with the wind and the unspoken truth. That evening, another message appeared. This time, it was delivered to Miss Marple's own doorstep. The paper was folded neatly, weighted with a small stone. She picked it up and unfolded it beneath the lamplight. "The book is not lost. It is being corrected. You are closer than you think. Be careful whom you trust." Miss Marple read it slowly, then smiled faintly. "Ah," she murmured, impatience. She sat at her desk and spread out everything she had gathered. The notebook. The earlier message. Her own memories of village gossip, past quarrels, old alliances that had shifted over time. A pattern emerged. The names in the notebook were not random. Each belonged to someone connected to a long-forgotten land dispute involving the quarry and the surrounding fields. A dispute that had ended conveniently with Thomas Bellamy's death. Someone had benefited greatly. Someone still lived in St. Meadows. Someone with influence. The missing library book, she realized, held the official version. The notebook held the truth someone had been unable to forget. Miss Marple leaned back, closing her eyes briefly. "Conscience," she said softly, "is a stubborn thing. Silence never cures it. It only makes it speak in stranger ways." Outside, the village settled into uneasy sleep. Doors were locked. Curtains were drawn tighter than usual. And somewhere, very close now, the missing book waited, along with the final piece of a story that refused to remain buried. Chapter 3: The Enigmatic Message and the Truth It Could No Longer Hide. The final piece of the mystery did not announce itself loudly. It arrived, as so many truths do, quietly and without ceremony, slipping into Miss Marple's understanding with the soft certainty of a door closing behind her. By the time the sun rose over St. Meadows the following morning, she already knew where the missing library book was, and more importantly, why it had been taken. She dressed carefully, as if preparing for a formal visit, choosing a modest hat and gloves that had seen many such moments before. Experience had taught her that revelations were best delivered calmly. Drama only encouraged denial, and denial was the last refuge of those who knew they had been discovered. Her first stop was not the library, nor the quarry, but the old Bellamy cottage on the edge of the village. It had been empty since Thomas Bellamy's death, preserved by neglect rather than care. Ivy climbed its walls unchecked, and the windows stared outward like unblinking eyes. Miss Marple knocked once. There was no answer. She tried the door. It opened easily. Inside, dust lay thick upon the furniture, but footprints marked a clear path toward the back room. Someone had been here recently. Someone careful enough to erase their presence from public spaces, yet careless enough to believe this place forgotten. In the corner stood a small writing desk. Beneath it, hidden behind a loose panel, Miss Marple found the book. The Complete Village Records of St. Meadows, Volume 3. She lifted it with reverence, brushing away the dust. Inside, several pages had been marked, annotated in the same firm handwriting as the notes and messages. Names circled. Margins filled with quiet outrage. Thomas Bellamy had not fallen. He had seen something. A transaction. A falsified boundary agreement that transferred quarry land to private ownership under questionable circumstances. When he threatened to speak, his death solved a problem for several people at once. Miss Marple closed the book slowly. "And now," she murmured, "someone wishes to unburden themselves without stepping into the light." That afternoon, she invited several villagers to tea. Mrs. Crowther, Clara Hughes, Mr. Finch. A gathering small enough to feel polite, yet tense enough to be revealing. They sat stiffly as Miss Marple poured the tea, her movements unhurried. "I believe," she said pleasantly, "that our missing book has been trying to tell us something." Mr. Finch's cup rattled slightly against its saucer. "The book," Miss Marple continued, "was taken not to destroy it, but to correct it. Or rather, to remind us of what it chose not to say." She opened the volume and read aloud a passage describing Thomas Bellamy's death. Then she read from the notebook, the contrast unmistakable. Mrs. Crowther pressed a hand to her mouth. Clara Hughes looked down at her lap. Mr. Finch stood abruptly. "This is absurd," he said. "Pure speculation." "No," Miss Marple replied gently. "It is memory. And memory, unlike paper, has a habit of surviving fire and silence alike." She turned to Clara. "You knew, didn't you?" Clara's composure finally cracked. Tears welled in her eyes. "I was there," she whispered. "I saw him argue with Mr. Finch by the quarry. I was young. Afraid. Everyone said it was an accident. So I told myself it was easier to believe." "And the messages," Miss Marple said softly. Clara nodded. "I could not live with it anymore. I did not want revenge. I only wanted the truth to exist again." Mr. Finch sank back into his chair, his authority evaporating. The room was silent except for the ticking of the clock on the mantel. "Truth," Miss Marple said quietly, "does not demand noise. Only acknowledgement." The authorities were notified. Statements were made. Long-buried facts surfaced. The village of St. Meadows, so proud of its order and calm, was forced to look directly at the shadow it had carried for 2 decades. The library book was returned to its shelf. But it no longer felt the same. Books, Miss Marple reflected, absorbed the weight of what they witnessed. That evening, as Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting in the fading light, she reflected on the affair. Mysteries did not always end with punishment. Sometimes, they ended with release. A conscience eased. A truth spoken at last. The final message arrived the next morning. This one bore no warning, no poetry. Only a single line. "Thank you for listening." Miss Marple folded it carefully and placed it inside the book, where it belonged. She looked out toward the quiet village and allowed herself a small, knowing smile. "Even the most orderly places," she said softly, "leave traces. One only needs to know how to read them." If you enjoyed this quiet unraveling of truth and the subtle wisdom of Miss Marple, do remember to like the video, share it with fellow mystery lovers, and subscribe to the channel for more carefully crafted classic-style mysteries. Your support ensures that these stories continue to be told, one hidden truth at a time.